After fighting the costliest battle in history for the next century at Borodino on September 7th, in which an estimated 35,000 soldiers of the Grande Armee perished, Napoleon and his army entered Moscow on September 15th, 1812. Expecting to be greeted by dignitaries and emissaries from Tsar Alexander's court, he is instead greeted by a city that is quite literally a ghost of its former self. The second and final chapter of Napoleon's doomed invasion of Russia is about to unfold. Having gambled on a quick and decisive campaign to capture Moscow, Napoleon's army had reached the end of its tether. With winter setting in and the supply situation almost at breaking point, the French Emperor knows that this move will seal the fate of both him and his soldiers. He had hoped that the loss of Moscow would pressure Alexander to sue for peace, allowing Napoleon to end the campaign, which had, as of then, cost almost 100,000 troops from across Europe. Yet, when he did enter the Russian heartland, he found his wishes shattered. 90% of the population had fled, and the city itself was burning by the time the emperor rode in. Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the city's governor, had ordered that Moscow be allowed to burn rather than have the French tricolor fly over it. Chaos was quite literally unleashed upon the city. Former prisoners were let loose, torches were held to every burnable surface, and even the great Kremlin was not to be spared this destruction. 4 days after entering the city, 2/3 of it had been destroyed, and no word had been received from the Russian Tsar about any form of surrender or negotiations. Napoleon, well aware that his troops were now suffering from the fatigue of an 83-day-long campaign, made the fatal decision to remain in Moscow until the very last possible moment. He had chosen to play a waiting game against Alexander, knowing full well that he, or so he believed, held all of the cards. Only when the first snow fell on October 13th did Napoleon realize he would have to scrap all plans of his army spending the winter in the city. To guarantee the safety of his supply routes and the survival of his troops, Napoleon ordered all 100,000 men with him to march back to Smolensk. Remember that from the previous video? A major supply depot 20 days march southwest of Moscow. On the 19th of October, his entire procession, some 10 miles long, abandoned the Russian city they had fought so brutally for, signaling the beginning of a retreat which would forever be immortalized in history as one of the Emperor's greatest mistakes. Napoleon had initially planned for his troops to withdraw via Kaluga, as opposed to the barren landscapes of Vyazma, where his army couldn't forage for supplies of food. But after the Battle of Maloyaroslavets on October 24th, Kutuzov, the Russian commander who was Napoleon's counterpart, now stood between his forces and Kaluga. Fearing the outright destruction of his troops, Napoleon decided to retreat the way they'd arrived to Moscow, along the Smolensk-Vyazma road. By October 29th, the temperatures had dropped below freezing, with the consequences being disastrous for the army. Its horses died en masse. The starving and sick were literally dumped by the side of the road by wagon trains seeking their own survival, and Napoleon himself had taken to wearing a vial of poison around his neck after a close shave with Russian Cossack horsemen, the equivalent of modern-day guerrilla troops. On the 9th of November, with temperatures already dropping to -20 degrees centigrade, Napoleon and the remnants of the army reached their supposed winter quarters in Smolensk. But after the bulk of the army raided the supply depot and left nothing for the rearguard troops, Napoleon realized that if they stayed there, they would never see the first thaw of spring. So 5 days later, he ordered the army out of Smolensk, and the retreat continued. Hampered by freezing winds and with the temperatures reaching -30 degrees centigrade, the Grande Armee becomes a shadow of its former self. Only after a desperate and bloody battle at the Berezina River on November 23rd did the retreat finally fall apart. Napoleon abandoned his men on December the 5th, leaving the remaining 20,000 or so still able to fight, from an original contingent of 124,000 at the mercy of the Russian winter and the vengeful Cossacks. Spirited away to Paris in just shy of 2 weeks, the Russian campaign is viewed and mocked by his enemies, not least the British, as the worst decision he'd ever made. Out of the 600,000 men who originally marched with him into the Russian heartlands, it's estimated that less than 20,000 marched back out with the Emperor. So with the story over, let's take a moment to discuss that statement that I made recently. Was the invasion of Russia a mistake? At the time, it seemed that Napoleon was making a logical choice. Indeed, many of his generals had been pushing for war with Russia ever since the Treaty of Tilsit began to fall apart. We have to be careful here not to judge his actions by the standards of our time, as that is something he would not have done himself. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, though it ended in shambles, certainly was not planned to be one of shambles. It was perhaps circumstances beyond the French Emperor's control and eventualities beyond his foresight that finally spelled the demise of his army and prestige in the freezing winters of Russia. The retreat itself was not a mistake. It was what any like-minded commander would have done in that situation, but of course different opinions over the decades and centuries have formed on that matter. Perhaps you have a different opinion of that of yourself, scholars. If you do, kindly let us know in the comments below. And with that, we end the special 2-part episode of this week. We're back to normal 1-part episodes, but no worries, we've got quite a lineup in the coming days. Next week, join us as we remain in Russia and spin the clock forward some 44 years, as we charge, pun intended, onto the battlefields of Crimea, where the Russians are once again squaring up against the French, without Napoleon this time. And this time around, it's the British who are once again being put to the sword. See you then, scholars.